I'd like to show you second generation stamping today. Now this is a really simple and easy technique that you can use all the time, but it does sound a little bit technical when we say second generation stamping, but I just want to break it down for you and show how simple it really is. So all I've got is I've got a stamp here, and this is just a clear stamp. It's a beautiful leafy sort of swirl really, and I've just mounted that onto an acrylic block. Now of course you can use a stamping platform like your rare earth load and fold if you'd prefer. It's completely up to you, but in this instance I'm just using an acrylic block. Now I'm going to take a piece of scrap cardstock. I'm going to take an ink pad. Now I'm using my Rare Earth Reactions ink pad in this beautiful green colour. And all second generation stamping is when we stamp our stamp for the first time, that's our first generation. The second impression without re-inking is our second generation, the third being the third generation, and so on and so on and so on. And what it means is we can get more versatility out of a single ink pad because we can get those different shades from that single ink pad. So, taking my ink pad, now these Reactions ink pads are hybrid ink pads, meaning they are a fusion of both dye and pigment ink. So they've got properties of both dye and pigment inks. So they will give us a crisp impression when we stamp with them. But because I'd probably be using this technique mainly for doing backgrounds, I'm not too bothered about having a really sharp, crisp image in this instance. So I've just inked that up. I'm just going to gently apply a bit of pressure. That's my first generation. Okay. Then so that's my scrap piece of paper. I could be using that for a project if I like. But if I take my piece of paper to use for my project, don't re-ink the stamp and just go in again. So applying a little bit more pressure now, as there'll be very little ink left on that stamp. You can see we get a much paler image there. So that's the first generation, and that is my second generation. So it almost looks like we've used two different ink pads, but we've not at all. We've used exactly the same ink pad on these two images. Now I'm going to push my luck a little bit. I'm going to see if I can get a third generation. Now this is not a particularly dark ink pad, so it might not work so well, but we will see. It might be nice for a subtle background. We'll see what we get. With darker ink pads, you can get sometimes a fourth and a fifth generation. It just depends, really. So you can see we have got a little bit of an image there. I would be using that for backgrounds, actually. I think that would work quite nicely. So you can see we've got first generation, second generation, and third generation. So just inking up once, using the same ink pad, and it doesn't have to be a Rare Earth Reactions ink pad to do this technique. You're doing it with any of your ink pads at all. I just really like the colour of this ink pad, and I find this stamp really nicely. So that's why I chose this ink pad for this particular technique. But of course, experiment with all your different ink pads. You will find that some ink pads will work better than others for this technique. So if you're using a particularly pale ink pad, so for example, if I use my Rare Earth Pink Petal, after the second generation it would probably be quite pale, so you'd probably not go on to third or fourth generations with a paler ink pad. But just have a little experiment, have a go. It's a fantastic way of creating backgrounds, but it's also great for creating perspective. So for example, if you were stamping some trees, you could have your ones in your foreground as your first generation, and as you moved back you could have your seconds and your third generations to give that sort of perspective. But it's a really fantastic technique, and it's so simple. I know the name sounds a little bit, this bit of jargon, it sounds quite technical, but all it is just the amount of times that you've stamped this same stamp without re-inking with your ink to create different effects. So that's all that second generation stamping is.